Welcome back to MMHC. Eddie and I have a very special guest for you today, but we want to introduce the topic. Today we're going to be mostly talking about yoga, and we wanted to have a yoga person, a yogi, on the show because I had actually had a really good conversation with my mom, and she told her that in her life that yoga has been incredibly useful for her own mental health and her own journey, and a lot for her own self-acceptance. And I thought that was a really cool thing. But she tried therapy and actually found that yoga was more useful. So serendipitously, we had a yoga instructor email us shortly after that conversation with my mom, and I thought, perfect, this is the stars aligning. So we have Aimee Huffman, who helps high achievers, entrepreneurs, and career-driven people develop mental strength, heal holistically from pain and disease, and perform at the highest level. She's a wellness educator and teaches corporate mindfulness as a tool for overcoming stress and burnout. She's passionate about using yoga as therapy to help people be powerful so they can also do powerful things in this world. She's a yoga therapist and a health coach based in Austin, Texas. Welcome to the show, Aimee Huffman.
Woo! Hello. Thank you. Great to
Thanks
be
for
here.
joining us. Yeah. Aimee, well, first off, hold on, Justin. You didn't even let me talk about like my experience with yoga. I thought you were gonna like toss it to me and be like, "What? How has yoga impacted your life, Eddie?" But you didn't even give me that. So, Aimee, sorry to cut you off. I'm gonna just give my one quick intro to yoga. Really, the only thing I told Justin this earlier today. My friends and I, a bunch of us, our senior year in college, took yoga as a human performance class. Like you could basically take like physical education classes at our school, and it was really hard. It was like, and it was during football season. So my friend, like our thought process was like, cool, we'll take yoga and it'll be good for us. Like it was on Wednesdays and Fridays, especially Friday mornings because we had like 6 a.m. practice. We're like, cool, we'll go to practice in the morning, go to breakfast, come back to school, yoga, and then I'll go to class the rest of the day, and it'll just get me in the good headspace. I'll be nimble, I'll be stretched out, and I had to work really hard in yoga class, but it was cool to be in it with my friends. So that is like my one intro to yoga. I have friends that have done yoga in the past. I know a lot of people have a lot of benefits from it. I've seen, and I don't know if we'll touch on it today, but yoga has kind of that connection, not with everybody, but with like definitely mindfulness. But with some people, there's also like a spiritual component to it. So there's a lot of people that I've seen it impact positively. So I want to share my one story of yoga. Now, Aimee, please, I'd love to hear about you. Love to hear about like your life story and how yoga fits into it. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today. We're excited to hear. We're just excited to hear from you. So again, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. And we actually have quite a bit in common, Eddie. I was also an athlete in college and took my first yoga class in college at the rec center.
Dope.
Yeah.
Nice.
I like to say that my experience with mindfulness started much earlier. So I've been a competitor my whole life. Starting at the age of 4, I was riding horses and barrel racing, and then it turned to volleyball, and then the mission was to get that Division I scholarship. And so I learned at a really young age how to push myself and how to do hard things and how to just like muscle it and get it done, and no pain, no gain, which I'm sure listeners can relate to. So getting to that next level just became so ingrained at a very young age. And while I did learn to channel my self-talk and focus to perform at this high level, once I got there, made it to being a Division I college athlete, that's where my body kind of said enough. Like you're pushing yourself and you're reaching this threshold. You have crossed the threshold, actually. And so I started to get these whispers of, you need to back off. And I think, as most 21-year-olds will do, we kind of ignored the whispers until they started getting louder and louder. And for me, those turned into panic attacks. And so the whispers started to get more intense and more intense until like full-blown panic. At very spontaneous random times throughout my day, driving in the car, in the middle of class, in the big lecture hall, feelings of someone sitting on my chest, my throat literally tightening, my body going numb, rushing to the emergency room because there was this inexplicable thing happening inside of me and I had no idea what it was, and I thought it was dying. And so those were very scary times, and anxiety became really crippling for me in college, specifically. And oddly enough, that's also when I took my first yoga class. And so it was this outlet that at first I connected to more on the physical realm, being an athlete and taking a physical type of yoga class, which is just one of the many types of yoga, really resonated with me and offered me an outlet to really start to explore what it felt like to sit with discomfort, to sit with feelings of anxiety or agitated energy, and then drop into that experience of like resting in a very easeful child's pose. And that experience of what softening a little bit felt like, because I had been so used to like going, just muscle it, just get there, that I needed to relearn what it was like to let myself regulate and let my body regulate itself, let my nervous system regulate itself. So that was my first introduction into yoga, and that's when I took my first teacher training, several years after college. And at that point, I was in adulthood and climbing that corporate ladder, as we do as we graduate from college. And I found myself in a pretty toxic work environment. I was working at a startup and striving to get to the top, and my body started whispering again. And this time it was in the form of waking up with hives on my body. My lips would be swollen. These inexplicable, seemingly random physical manifestations of anxiety and worry and fear, things that I was so used to pushing beneath the surface. It was rising up again, like it needed to get out. All of these flags were waving. But this time I had a greater sense of awareness that I listened. And so I took a step back and I realized this is not the environment for me. And I was able to use my practice as a tool to go deeper and to recognize that my purpose was actually to share this in my experience with others. And so that's when I found yoga therapy and went through an 1,100-hour yoga therapy certification over 2.5 years. So the equivalent of like getting your master's in yoga. Using yoga as therapeutic modality. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I work with high performers, people who are pushing themselves, people who are competitors, entrepreneurs, and helping them find balance and helping them create more flexibility within their nervous system and helping them address their mental health without necessarily needing to do it from a thinking, cognitive way. By learning to drop into their bodies and getting to know their bodies. Because I think we have this misconception that mental health and health in general is controlled by the mind and the brain. But it's the body that really is wired to be the operator, the nervous system specifically. And so using yoga as a way to get familiar and engage with cues from my nervous system in the form of anxiety helped me befriend my nervous system in a way that I'm no longer scared or fearful when I start to feel anxiety or a panic attack coming on, because I still get them. Because I know now I have a solid tool to bring myself back, and yoga being that tool and methodology.
You mentioned a startup. And I made a joke before we started where Justin commented on what I was wearing. And if you're listening, you don't need to watch the YouTube video. But if you're listening, I'm wearing like a flannel and like a vest over it. And I told Aimee and Justin that I was going for like the tech bro, like finance kind of like vibe. But you mentioned startup, and I know I'm originally from the San Jose Bay Area, where like tech and startups are like that is like the culture. That's like the second culture of the Bay Area. And I know like that hustle culture is like can be incredibly toxic. One, I guess my first question is like, where were you? Like, what part of the country were you at when you were working in that startup, and like what was that like for you? Like, and I don't want to have to revisit like anything that was too like traumatic or negative for you, but like what was that like for you?
So I was in Austin, Texas, which has become its own tech hub in the last 5 to 10 years. And at first I was excited because it felt like startup, and startup has this connotation of like success and fast-paced and energizing and making money and like you're on the right path. And then when I got into it, it was like, whoa, this feels like very chaotic, frenetic energy for me and my personality and my constitution. It was a successful startup and ended up being very successful, but I found that the energy around me just really threw me off balance, and there wasn't an emphasis on work-life balance, which is kind of what you expect in the startup world. But you don't recognize how quickly you fall into just doing mode 24/7, like going, moving, thinking, planning, performing. And even in those moments where there was downtime, I felt like the frenetic energy, even in that space of like pushing me to go out and socialize and do more, and kind of fill this space that was really uncomfortable and didn't really allow me time to settle and relax, because as soon as I would settle and relax, then I would have to go back into the office the next day. And it was like, do, plan, think, fast pace, go, go, go. And it was just hard to align with that lifestyle for me. And I think for many people, they get caught up in that hamster wheel of just going. And it takes an event to hop off the wheel to recognize that you were on it in the first place. But what I love about yoga and mindfulness practices is that you get to practice, especially the way that I teach and incorporate into my yoga therapy. Like you practice getting on the hamster wheel, if you will, and like arousing and stimulating the system. And then you practice calming, and you practice what it's like to step off, like the visceral experience. Because when you're in those spaces, startups or just fast-paced roles, your body forgets what it feels like to be in a settled, grounded place. And so that's what I love about yoga therapy is that there is a visceral experience that happens. Like you don't have to think yourself into learning how to relax or think yourself into handling anxiety or depression, but you get to practice with your body and your breath state shifts, if that makes sense.
I love it. And I think you made so many good points there, where so many people think the mind is in control of your mental health, but it's such a duality. It is your mind and your body, and your body contributes so much, from the foods you eat to your muscles to everything is connected through your nervous system and also through your hematologic system, your blood. There are chemicals being transferred from both. And so it's cool to hear you explain that sometimes it helps in yoga to get yourself worked up a little bit, get that heart rate pumping, and then learn how to calm yourself down. I feel like that is so much more useful than a lot of times we talk to, or I speak to kids specifically, a little bit about meditation, and meditation is great. But sometimes it's hard for kids to get into that mindset and buy into meditation. I feel like they're more likely to buy into something like yoga. One question I had for you, Aimee, is I appreciate so much that you shared your story and opened up about your mental health. What specifically has been useful for you in the broad spectrum of yoga for helping you in those moments where panic's coming on, where anxiety's coming on?
I think it's shifted over the last decade or so as my practice has shifted and evolved, and as I've gotten deeper into self-study and different teachers and introduced to different modalities and types of yoga. I think early on it was helpful to start with my body and my breath. So when I think of anxiety, you know, it's fear, there's a certain arousal, that sympathetic reaction of like, you know, when something runs across the road and you slam on your brakes and there's that spike. And so for me, it was helpful with the physical practice of yoga to kind of work that energy through my body, to move the cortisol in my body in a more physical way. And then it was this ladder of like, then I began to use the breath and creating this synchronicity between breath and movement that you'll see oftentimes in like a vinyasa class or a flow class. That created a really steady metronome for my mind. Because I think this is true for a lot of people who are newer to yoga. There is so much arousal and adrenaline and cortisol in the body from stress that if you try to sit down and meditate or go into a restorative yoga class, you're going to feel like you're crawling out of your skin. And so that's why it's helpful to move energy through the body before you try to, you know, sit with the mind and meditate. So it was really the physical practice first, and then it was the breathing practices. And for me personally, this is what I love about yoga therapy, where you're working one-on-one with an individual. There would be times when I would go into group classes and the way someone was cueing breath would spark anxiety in me, and I would feel like I was about to have a panic attack. And so I just learned that I didn't work with the breath during those periods of times. But as I began to become more familiar with my nervous system and what it felt like to feel like there was an anxiety attack coming on, then I learned to work with the breath specifically through like an extended exhalation, which we did before we hopped on, that straw breath. Because when you slow down the exhale, the research and the science shows that it applies almost this brake to the sympathetic nervous system. It provides a slowing down, and that rest and digest side of the nervous system activates, which allows us to just step back, to drop back, and regulate. So it was the physical practices first, learning to be with the long, slow exhale. And I would say most recently, since COVID times, it is resting in restorative poses, like my legs up the wall and just letting myself be in what I like to practice and call do nothing time, where I'm not even necessarily doing a specific practice. I'm just practicing being. And, you know, it took me a while to get there. But I found that for my system and where I'm at now, oftentimes, like, that's what I need. I need to practice being in stillness. That's what, you know, when you think of yoga, bringing balance to the system. For most of us, we're doing. We have to balance that with being and resting. And how much time are we actually being and resting in our day-to-day, aside from when we're sleeping? And even then, it's pretty active states in sleep. So now it's more of the resting and the being and setting a timer for 10 minutes and just letting myself drop back and, you know, notice my breath, notice my thoughts as they pass. There's some meditation in there, but it's a much less physical practice than what it used to be.
Yeah. I like the trying to, like, consciously take a break. Because if you think about it, like, a lot of us, I know for me specifically, like, I wake up and like I'm just doing, like, I'm doing stuff, like I'm getting ready for work, or I gotta do this before I leave the house, or I gotta pack my lunch, whatever, and then it's do, and then I drive to work, and then I drive back home, or I work in between, but then I drive back home, and then I get, you know, we're just doing, and then next thing you know, it's time to go to sleep. But like, to your point, like, it's not always like restful, or it's not always like you're done. Like, I think taking a break, being mindful of that, is very important to remember, because I think I forget it a lot. Even though we're trying to, like, help teens or help whoever our clientele are, we forget it a lot. One thing I was thinking about as you're sharing, like, pieces of yoga and the different types of yoga there is and different just modalities there are, one question that we've written down is, like, what are some of the most common misconceptions about yoga, and then how do you like to address them? Because I think for people, when we don't understand something, we go off of like what we've heard or what like just the misconceptions are. Like what have you heard? How do we address those? How can we give our listeners something to take away, or multiple somethings to take away from today's episode?
I was going to say there's so many.
Yeah.
We touched on one, and this relates more so, I think, to meditation, but meditation being part of yoga, mindfulness, kind of all fall within the same umbrella, is that yoga and meditation is about being calm and relaxed. And I hear so many, so often from high performers, people who are used to doing, which is many of us, is I just can't calm my mind. I can't stop my thoughts. Like, it's not going to work for me. Yeah. And I'll say, well, what if that wasn't the goal? What if that's not the point? What if it's not about being calm and relaxed? What if it's about just being more present with what you're experiencing in the moment? Whether that be good or bad, comfortable or uncomfortable, but just learning to sit with it, being present with what's already happening for you and kind of removing a layer of the story, just being curious about what you're experiencing in your body in this moment. Are you aroused? Are you lethargic? Are your thoughts racing about that conversation that you had an hour ago? Can you notice that and then come back to your body, come back to your breath? And so I think remembering that piece of like, it's about being present with what is, because when you're present, then you have choice. Then you can make a choice of what you want to do next in that situation. Not about being calm and relaxed. And I think that can help people just take a little pressure off that, like, I need to get a certain result out of this class. I need to feel better. I need to feel relaxed. And if I don't, then I'm not doing it right. And I like to hit on that because I think that can prevent people from stepping into the practice. And so that's a big one.
Yeah. God, what a knowledge drop. That was cool. Thank you.
It's a big one, yeah.
I love it too, because so many things in the mental health arsenal are like a tool belt. Like meditation might be your thing, yoga might be your thing, therapy might be your thing, exercise might be your thing in general. We wanted to have this episode largely because we wanted to give you guys another tool, because yoga can be so very beneficial for mental health. We always strive to be an evidence-based show. And there was actually a large meta-analysis by Brinsley et al. In 2021 in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, showing that yoga was able to reduce depression symptoms in people who had been diagnosed with clinical depression. Along like the misconceptions, like what you want people to know, what stories do you have of people's mental health benefiting from yoga? We heard about yours already a little bit, but like any other big stories, any other powerful things that you can recall?
Well, you mentioned tools, and so speaking of a tool and a system, I think that there's a few clients specifically that come to mind who are in that startup world as entrepreneurs who have found a lot of benefit in the tool of yoga, the tools of yoga in different capacities depending on the day. So working with a sales entrepreneur, and actually did a research study around this individual, so I know he won't mind me sharing. A research study, 12 weeks of using yoga therapy, specifically specific tools, breathing, postures, and meditation. And at the end of it, he found that the breathing tools were so helpful in being able to regulate in the moment situations of overwhelm or anxiety. Being a sales entrepreneur and talking 1,000 miles a minute and moving at a really fast pace every day, the breathing tools and the regulation allowed him to drop back into, to quote him, states of being where there was nothing to achieve. And in those states of recognizing that it wasn't about making the moment better or different, then he was able to find self-acceptance that had been out of reach for a while. And that just, I get goosebumps even talking about it. So the breath practice was really impactful for his mental health, in addition to a guided meditation that we did together, where specifically we were moving through different parts of the body, through the ventral vagal, the vagus nerve branches of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there was a prompt that I invited, which was to repeat that, to say your name and to say the words, "I love you." And this came at the end of a practice, right? So we had already moved the body, we'd already moved the energy, we'd already done some breathing regulation, and then we were in this soft space. And him repeating those words to himself, even if it felt contrived at first, he had mentioned that that was possibly one of the most impactful things that he had learned to do again, in the spirit of self-compassion and self-acceptance and remembering to love himself.
Wow.
Because that had been so out of reach for so long. And just saying those words were so potent within that meditation that he wouldn't have taken it upon himself and wouldn't have felt the visceral experience of like just being at peace with what is.
Go ahead, Justin. I'm thinking.
I love it. I think that's so cool. And there's so many things about yoga therapy that I want to know. And so give us a little idea about what's the difference between yoga and yoga therapy. And yeah, just so curious. It seems like such an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's also exactly where I wanted to go.
Well, yoga therapy is the application of the tools of yoga. So the postures, the breath, the philosophy, the wisdom in a one-on-one setting or a very small group setting, working to help the individual address a specific imbalance or an injury or dis-ease, whether that be physically or mentally, and helping them find balance and healing. And so with the yoga therapist, there's an entirely different level of training. An 1,100-hour training is what I went through to get the certification through the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And so in a yoga therapy session, there is an intake, there's an assessment, there's a posture assessment, there's a breath assessment. So similarly to when you go in to see your doctor or your psychiatrist or your psychotherapist, there's an intake. You want to know specifically where this person is at so you can meet them where they are. And then you work together on which tools are going to be most beneficial for this person. Are they an entrepreneur who's going through performance anxiety? Maybe there's some depression, and then there's some insomnia. The tools that I use to help them find balance are going to be different than, for example, someone who is recovering from perhaps a surgery, who's experiencing chronic pain, who it's hard for them to get out of bed in the morning. So I'm going to approach those differently and draw upon the wide range of tools within the yoga therapy bucket, if you will. Now, in a yoga class, you're working with a yoga instructor in a group class setting that just doesn't have the capacity to personalize for an individual who, whether it's physical pain, whether there's trauma in their history, whether there is mental health conditions happening. As I experienced in my own body, I went into a public class and doing hot yoga even, or doing certain breath exercises to no fault of the instructor, but it just sent me into a literal panic, and it wasn't for me. So when you're working with a yoga therapist who's trained in that way, you're with them in a safe container where if you feel panic or you feel like you're moving out of that safe range, and they're there to help guide you back, not to mention give you the exact tools that are going to be the most beneficial. So there's several differences. Mostly I think the personalized individual touch to help someone who's really looking to address something similar within themselves and has a specific goal in mind. Sure, I work with people who are really just wanting general well-being and to feel better. Oftentimes when we get going into a session, different things rise to the surface, and it's my job to kind of be the detective and where are the imbalances within the different sheets of the body. And that's a big difference as well. Within yoga therapy, we're using the Eastern approach to anatomy, which looks at the body in 5 different layers or sheaths. And so there's actually a free resource for your listeners, a guided meditation that kind of moves through those different sheets to give you an experience of what that would be like. But that's the main difference as well in yoga therapy, that you're probably not likely to get in a yoga class unless it's a very experienced instructor in a small group setting.
Mm-hmm. How common are yoga therapists? Like, it's not something I've really known about until I met you.
Yeah. The International Association of Yoga Therapists, I believe, late 80s. It is a growing field, is very, very much growing. And, we're in that stage of creating the written test to become a licensed form of therapy. And so that's really exciting.
Whoa.
That yoga therapy would be up there with a licensed psychotherapist. Massage therapy has licensure, occupational therapy. So I don't think we're too far off from that, which is really, really exciting. It's definitely growing. It's a growing field, and also with the research in yoga in general, it can be challenging to draw the empirical research that's often needed sometimes to legitimize it, because it can be a subjective experience. And so how do you measure that within someone? But there are the research around using brain scanning and different technologies at different universities, and research studies around that just continues to grow and grow and grow. So it's a really exciting time.
I will say we are big fans of the subjective experience and data, because I think that is such a big part of like psychotherapy or mental health therapy. Is like we can look at research and what. I'm gonna stop myself before I go too far, but just like what is evidence based? Like, what does that even mean? Who's like, right. I don't know. There's so much more to it. So we 100% are fans and believers in like subjective experience and how important that is as evidence, and it should be taken just as important as objective data and random controlled trials and all that good stuff. It is super important.
And I love that Eddie said, "I'm going to stop myself," and then he keeps going.
No, I did. Whatever I had in my head, I did stop myself. But, God damn it.
Yeah. I think you made a good point, because sometimes that subjective stuff is how you get enough people talking about it. Hey, this was impactful for me, to then hopefully go on to get some more of the objective, some of the studies, and hopefully find ways to be able to study it. I'm going to throw a wrench into this conversation a little bit and say, or an ask, have you ever seen yoga lead to any negative outcomes? And the scope of this question is, I've heard that QAnon really exploded in the wellness and yoga circles. So just wondering if you've ever experienced anything like this or seen yoga do anything bad.
I have not personally. I would say, though, I'm quite young into my my yogic career compared to the lifelong yogis and teachers out there. I haven't personally, but I have heard of groups, cults centered around yoga, and have had dear teachers that were part of this and who learned a lot from the experience. But I myself have not, fortunately. In terms of more personal harm that I've experienced, and I think that a common harm that can happen if people are not mindful with the type of yoga that they're doing is the opportunity for injury. And so for me personally, I was pushing myself and went to some classes that I shouldn't have been with, some back injuries, and ended up increasing the pain. And I think that can happen, especially as yoga is being offered more in Western medicine, which, like, yay, all for it. But there's a difference when, a doctor tells a patient, well, go to a yoga class. Okay, well, what kind of yoga? Yeah. If this person, what is their history? If they have some herniated discs, then probably shouldn't be starting out with a power class, maybe more of a restorative, or maybe seeking out a yoga therapist. Same thing, someone who PTSD or has experienced abuse, going into a yoga class, I have seen some harm happen just in re-traumatizing the system that can come from going into certain yoga classes and even certain styles that can unfortunately and unintentionally do harm. So I think the point is just being mindful on like what type of yoga you are needing perhaps, and also being willing to experiment, right? Like just because you go into a class and it ended up hurting you a little bit and you actually couldn't touch your toes and it was frustrating, maybe don't give up just yet. Maybe it's just about finding the right teacher or the right class, because it's so broad and expansive, and the types are just so rich and diverse.
As you were sharing that, I think of just like the importance of, or how I've heard from people in the past of like, well, I had a mental health therapist before, but it went poorly, so I don't want to do that again. Or these are the really harmful things my previous counselor or therapist told me. And I think we almost have an uphill battle that you and I can relate to, Aimee. Not as much you, Justin, but that we can relate to in terms of like, there seems to be like, if there's one negative bad experience in both of our fields, then that's just kind of it for people. But when it comes to like maybe like medical doctors, or I guess medical doctors is really where I'm thinking of, is like they have one bad experience and it's like, it's fine, I'll just find another doctor, and I think that's really important to share, of like don't give up. Like, yeah, and it's hard because like in my own field, like I see there's bad therapists. I don't want to say all the time, but there's bad therapists. I mean, for you, Aimee, I'm sure there's unfortunately like not so great yoga therapists. And I know, Justin, we've talked, like there's not great psychiatrists and medical doctors in general. But I think for us too, it's that reminding people of like one bad experience, like please don't let that ruin it for the rest of your life. Like there's always going to be opportunity to find that positive impact, or that positive clinician or instructor or yoga therapist that can make a positive impact on us.
Such a great point, that openness to experience. And sure, there's a lot of bad drivers out there, but there's also a lot of good drivers. So
I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. My coworker and I were talking just today of how like, so she was saying how like, sometimes I forget how hard our job is, or like how hard it can be working with students and families. And I told her, I'm like, it sometimes it is really hard. And sometimes it's that 95.6%, my made up statistic, 95.6% of families like are amazing and great and understand and are totally helpful. But then there's sometimes those maybe not so great families that we work with that are really tough and take a lot of our time and a lot of our resource. But we just have to be open to knowing that like those things come and go, and that's okay. We'll have the positive experiences that will like refill our cup and make us feel fulfilled, and make us feel like it's not the only thing we work with or deal with every day.
And it does seem like yoga would benefit the vast majority of people. Before I mostly started working with kids, I would tell all my older patients, like, get into yoga, because it's all about core strength and balance and mindfulness. It's all these things that'll help you as you get older, help you prevent falls, like so many good things. Like, how do you feel about the community? Is there anyone that you would actually say maybe yoga is not a good thing for them? And how do you feel just about the yoga community in general in terms of their openness and acceptingness?
I think that it is really a modality for all humans, for all bodies, for all types. Anyone who is experiencing pain or disease, or just feeling a little off within themselves. People who are interested in it being a spiritual path and journey. People who want to be a little more flexible and want to keep their joint strength as they get older. Anyone who just is instinctively maybe knowing that it's time to make their well-being a little more priority. I don't think there's any limit, and that's the beautiful thing, and it's so unique in it being a tool and a system, is that it is so adaptable. When you think about the word yoga, to join or to yoke, referring to the body and the mind, you can be sitting intentionally, noticing your breath, noticing your thoughts, noticing where you are in space and time, and that's yoga. There doesn't need to be any movement involved. Yeah. I think the community in general is very welcoming and opening. Not just saying that because I consider myself a yogi, but I find when I'm going to new places, the first thing I want to do is to try out a new studio, because people who are there tend to have a certain openness. Not always, some people are having a bad day and, they wanted to go to yoga and that was that. But I think in general, people are coming for very similar reasons. That creates even an unspoken camaraderie.
I have one question. Well, we have a lot of questions, but we don't want to keep you forever, Aimee. But I think one question as we get ready to, I could talk forever too. At least that's what my elementary school teacher said.
But he's not holding a grudge. Yeah.
No. As we get ready to wind down from being able to have you on our show, Aimee, what is, and this might be hard to choose one, but 1 to 3, whatever fits best. But what are some things that you wish that you had known before you started your healing journey?
That is a hard one. Just one to 3. I think that it's about riding the wave. That it's about learning to ride the highs and the lows, and it's not about avoiding being at the highs or the lows, but being able to find a steady middle ground, being able to find a sense of discernment, if you will. I think if I could go back in time and tell younger Aimee that would be a big one. Just in learning to take the journey as it is, as I'm creating flexibility within my system, and not just talking about, like my hamstrings getting more flexible, but knowing that there's like deeper work happening, and there's not just some goal that I'm searching for at the top. That it really is just learning to create this sense of discernment, because it will become so applicable throughout my life. So I think that's a big one. Let's see, something else I wish I would have known in my journey, and I touched on this in the misconception, it's not about being good or bad. It's not about finding calm or relaxed. It's just learning to widen my awareness of, and this is a meditation cue that is rather popular, of the sky of the mind. I don't know if y'all have ever heard that. And so meditation, you can think of the mind as this big blue sky, and the thoughts are like the clouds that they come and they pass, and they're transient in nature, and the weather changes, but the vast openness of the sky is always there. That consciousness, that level of consciousness, is always wide and open and receiving whatever appears moment to moment. And so even though it might be a cloudy day that is filled with blame or shame, regret, whatever it might be, being able to trust that the clouds are going to pass, and actually practice that in a sense of visualization, that would be something I would spend more time with in my earlier days, and I think has really been impactful and stuck with me throughout my yogic journey. And it's such a beautiful visual that I hope resonates with listeners, of being able to remember that you are not the clouds. You are that big, blue, beautiful sky.
I love that. That positive visualization stuff is so very powerful. And I even was thinking recently, there was an instance where I realized when I was a kid, I used to do it when I would be scared at night of people breaking into the house or something, weird thoughts that you have as a kid. I used to imagine myself like underneath an angel's wing, and how useful that was when I was a kid. And I learned that strategy from my dad, who told me that he used to do the same thing. So I love that you're imparting that to your patients, the people that you work with, that positive visualization, because it can be so powerful.
Yeah, and I will say that visualization and meditation and the felt experience of it, the feeling of like the protective wing visualization and what it feels like within your body, and the same thing of being able to feel yourself as the sky of the mind. Those are techniques that I didn't learn until later on when I got into yoga therapy, experiencing it myself and studying it. And so I think it's something that I've seen shift someone's perspective and state in a moment, because they were able to remember what it felt like in the body to be safe and protected using visualization, or remember what it felt like to find joy or contentment, asking someone to call in a joyful memory, and visualize where they were, and the sights and the sounds and the smells and who's around them, and then what does that feel like in your body? Where do you feel tingling and warmth? And so just that mind-body connection is just so powerful. I love hearing that story.
Well, Justin?
Yes, we are getting to the end of our show. Towards the end of things, we always like to give a couple examples of celebrities that are connected to the theme for the show. So, in no particular order, here are a couple of celebrities who swear by yoga. So, the ones that I found were apparently David Beckham, way into yoga, Matthew McConaughey, Jennifer Aniston, Justin Timberlake, Lady Gaga, Beyonce, and Russell Simmons. So, a pretty impressive list of celebrities.
Yeah.
I'd say so. Quite a diverse crowd.
Exactly.
It is adaptable and accessible for all.
Yeah. That's my take home point. I was gonna steal that and say yoga's for everyone. And I'm gonna leave it at that. That's what I'm taking from today.
I like it. Aimee, what's your take home point? The one thing you want people to walk away with after listening?
I really love Eddie's yoga is for everyone.
That's okay to use
I'll
someone
find a new
else's.
one. You go first. Go back to me, Justin. What's your take home?
My take home point, unfortunately, has nothing to do with yoga. I was going to use my take home point to shout out Eddie and his family.
Oh.
Because I'm going to have a son in 2 days. My wife is scheduled for a C-section on Friday, and Eddie's family just sent us an entire package of these just amazing blankets. And so, I'm so excited to wrap that sweet little boy up in those cute little blankets. So I just wanted to say, thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Mrs. Eddie's mom, Mrs. Carrillo. I know that you've been listening to the show, and that means so much to us. We love you guys, and from the Romanos to the Carrillos, we love you guys so much.
We love you too. Thanks, Mom.
Oh, that's so sweet. I don't want to follow that.
That's okay. This is a perfect opportunity. Tell our listeners where they can find you. We're going to tag you all over the place on our Instagram, but tell our listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, so find me at aimeehuffman.com. And I also have a free download guided meditation for everyone, aimeehuffman.com/transform stress and anxiety.
Perfect. We'll add that to the show notes. We'll make sure it's available to everyone. This is the part where I say the same exact thing at the end of every episode. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, whatever other podcast listening apps there are. On Apple Podcasts, if you feel inclined to do so, you can leave us a 5-star review. You can also leave us a comment, and we'll see it at some point. On Spotify, you can leave us a 5-star review. There's apparently also an option where you can leave a question. Feel free to do that. I don't know how we respond to it, but it's there. On social media, on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I think it's all at Millennial MHC. Thank you all for listening. Thank you again, Aimee, for being a guest on our show. We enjoyed it very much. We're excited for everyone to hear this episode. And as always, take care of y'all mentals. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.